Before you cheer for another bipartisan broadband expansion, listen closely, because what Congress is pushing right now isn't just about faster internet. It's about gutting the very environmental protections that keep vulnerable communities safe. This bill would let corporations build in toxic zones, Superfund sites, and historic neighborhoods with zero oversight and zero public input. They're selling it as efficiency, but the real cost is paid by the people already living on the front lines of pollution, and they hope you never look closely enough to notice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very concerned about what this bill does to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I'm a staunch defender of the environment, and many of you know how hard the man who this room is named after worked on NEPA as an original author and having it signed into law. Today, NEPA remains one of our nation's strongest tools to ensure communities have meaningful input on major federal actions. And that's why I'm deeply concerned with Title III, Section 301 of this amendment, which would exempt any covered project from both NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 301 says that any federal authorization for a covered project cannot be considered a major federal action under NEPA and cannot be considered an undertaking under NHPA. In practice, that means no environmental review and no historic preservation review. Full stop. And the definition of a covered project is incredibly broad. It includes the mounting, the installation, or modification of wireless facilities, wireline deployments on existing infrastructure, small cells, and nearly all work in public rights-of-way. It also includes any deployment in a brownfield, which should alarm anyone whose community has ever dealt with environmental cleanups or Superfund sites, something Southeast Michigan knows too well. These are areas where vulnerable communities already bear the brunt of pollution and climate risk. Under this legislation, broadband infrastructure in brownfields would totally bypass environmental review. Covered projects also include post-disaster rebuilds, equipment swaps, removing insecure equipment, and projects under FCC geographic licenses. Even significant modifications like antenna swaps, equipment upgrades, or expansion of existing towers are already largely exempt under existing categorical exclusion parameters. In effect, almost every routine wireless and wireline deployment already skips any serious level of NEPA review altogether. NEPA's directive is straightforward. The federal government must consider how a project will affect the environment, and the people impacted should have a real chance to weigh in. That includes examining climate impacts, environmental justice concerns, and effects on culturally or historically sensitive sites. Eliminating those reviews means eliminating the voices of frontline communities, many of which have been ignored or overburdened for too long. I believe we should have bipartisan conversations about smart and targeted permitting reform. And I've said before, I welcome an honest conversation about long-term NEPA modernization that protects communities while allowing projects to move efficiently. But this proposal takes the wrong approach. It doesn't streamline NEPA, it guts it. We should not have to choose between deploying broadband and protecting bedrock environmental laws. We can and should do both. What we cannot do is adopt exemptions that silence communities and undermine decades of environmental protection. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to reject this aims and oppose this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
What you just heard from Congresswoman Debbie Dingell is more than a policy disagreement. It's a warning about what happens when lawmakers push modernization in name only, while quietly stripping away the very safeguards meant to protect communities from environmental harm. And this isn't abstract. This is the kind of change that reshapes neighborhoods, burdens vulnerable communities, and silences people who have spent decades fighting to be heard. Dingell is sounding the alarm on a proposal that claims to speed up broadband expansion, but in reality, it does so by gutting the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, one of the most important environmental review tools in the country. NEPA is the reason communities get notified before a major federal project happens near their homes. It's the reason agencies must consider impacts on water, air quality, climate, wildlife, cultural sites, and public health. It's the law that forces the government to slow down long enough to ask who will be harmed by this. This bill does the opposite. It declares that broadband deployments, even in sensitive areas like brownfields, Superfund sites, or post-disaster zones, are not major federal actions. That's not called modernizing, that's called erasing oversight entirely. And Dingell is right to point out who pays for that erasure: the very communities already carrying the burden of pollution, toxic exposure, and environmental neglect. When she mentions southeastern Michigan, she's talking about places where families have lived next to industrial pollution for generations, where soil contamination has been inherited like a curse, where the legacy of bad policy is still in the groundwater. And now, under this bill, those same neighborhoods would see new infrastructure go up without a single environmental check. Broadband expansion is necessary, absolutely. Access to high-speed internet is a modern essential. But Dingell's point is that we don't need to sacrifice environmental protections in order to build. We don't need to strip away the voices of frontline communities to get faster deployment. The real issue isn't NEPA. It's the unwillingness of lawmakers and corporations to invest the time, money, and labor required to do things responsibly. NEPA doesn't stop projects. It forces accountability. It forces transparency. And when Congress moves to remove that oversight, the question isn't whether broadband goes up faster. The question is what damage will be ignored in the process. Who gets overlooked? Who gets exposed? Her message is simple. Efficiency without accountability is not progress. It's regression. And if we allow lawmakers to start carving away at environmental review here, it won't stop at broadband. It never has. This is the kind of legislation that passes quietly, hidden behind the feel-good language of innovation and efficiency. But as Dingell says, the voices being removed, the protections being stripped, those are real. And it's up to all of us to push back before the communities who already carry the heaviest environmental burdens lose the last tools they have to defend themselves. If you care about environmental justice, transparency, and real community oversight, make sure you stay engaged. These quiet policy changes have loud consequences. And as always, if you want more sharp, clear, and uncompromising breakdowns of what really goes on in Congress, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay locked in with Left Lens.